Hi, it looks like it's about 10 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. My presentation is making it easy for users to maintain their own content. I'm going to be going over one of the first Drupal 8 websites I worked on that used content moderation. My name's Andrew Cox. I'm a web development manager at ICF. I've been with ICF a little bit over 2 years. I've been a Drupal developer for a little bit over 10 years. Developed for a variety of different organizations, newspaper, a university, a couple of healthcare websites, e-commerce website, and a small ad agency. Outside of work, I'm married with 3 kids. I also want to give a shout out to my daughter, who was really disinterested that I was presenting until she found out that I'm going to be on YouTube. So anyway, Evelyn, hi. She's going to be probably watching this in the middle of watching people unwrap LOL dolls. I don't get the YouTube phenomenon at all with kids. So before I get started, since I realize I'm on the content management track, I'm more of a developer, I just wanted to ask, who here would consider themselves a developer in the audience? All right, cool. Looks like about a quarter of you guys. Okay, and then who here has spent more time than they care to admit for a website that they've done for a client actually updating content via an email they've received? Okay, a few hands. Another side question related to that, does that email include an attachment with a Word document that's really like hard to understand and has a bunch of fields and you have to copy and paste it, etc.? Okay. So Drupal 8, one of the cool things is since Drupal 8.4, they've introduced content moderation in the core. But in addition to that, I know Drupal 8, one of the big, even in the keynote at DrupalCon a few months ago, there's a lot of inline editing tools available now, and they're great. And they're kind of taking a page from WordPress admin, where it's kind of built for content editors. But my biggest peeve is, what's the point of that if the users actually aren't trusted to manage their own content, or if it's unused? It's great. As a developer, I've spent more time than I care to admit updating a website, but that's partially where content moderation comes in, so you can sort of give the keys of the castle to someone else to handle that. So that being said, I am a developer. I realize there's a few developers in the audience. I will try to keep my code examples at a high level, and not just because this is my first Drupal 8 website and I'm not really happy with my code anymore, but also because I've been in meetings and I've seen eyes glaze over when I get too technical, so I'm going to try to avoid that. Okay, so the website I'm going to talk about is the OPA Title 10 database. It is a Drupal 8 redesign. It was launched a little over 2 years ago on Drupal 8.2. Uses the Acquia Lightning distribution. The big feature of it is that it uses the Google Location API. So that does 2 things. One is you type a location in the search box, whether it's a city name or a zip code, and it'll autocomplete. You search, it'll show a list of women's health services based on your location. You click on there and you can view profile. And most relevantly, and this is kind of where the core of my presentation is, all of the Title 10 grant recipients, they're responsible for ensuring that their information is up to date. So while sometimes there is manual setup, for the most part, if a phone number changes, if office hours changes, if services offered change, all that information, the user has to change it. So I'm just going to pause for a minute. I have to switch screens, and then I'm just going to give a quick demo of the site before I go further. Title 10 database site. Just as an example, this is the live site. I type in, say, Seattle. Let's see, so I type Seattle. Search. It shows the map, and the pieces of content that are moderated are these clinic pages. So you'll see there's not a lot of copy per se. There are a couple of long-form text fields, but it's mostly taxonomy, references. There is a address stored. In addition, and this is a pretty straightforward basic website, there's also widgets, so the search can be embedded on other sites. Pretty straightforward there. So anyway, go back. For the Title 10 database, there are over 4,700 pieces of moderated content. You can see there's about 100 grantees, over 1,000 subrecipients. Those are essentially the same content type, and essentially really all 4,700 are the same. I'll get into a little bit of the differences later. But the content, most importantly, is primarily managed by a few hundred content owners who can also create certain content as well, so that when you edit or add content, it can fall into the moderation workflow just like any existing content is edited. So there's really no limit. There is an issue though, if a piece of content is created and it's in draft and not published, it's not assigned a node ID yet. So sometimes it makes sense to publish a piece of content that just has bare bones information and then have it go through a content workflow. And again, for the most part, the only thing there are content admins needed is when content's being permanently deleted, or we actually just set its state to unpublished or closed. And again, even though we have a really good content workflow set up, some users still don't manage their own content. So it's easier to use content moderation with Drupal 8. Content moderation has been slowly improving over time. It's pretty much been a sore spot ever since I've been using Drupal. So I remember even way back on Drupal 5 or Drupal 4.7, content moderation really hasn't been used that heavily, but it has been getting improved. And now that the functionality is in core since Drupal 8.4, there is better documentation showing up on Drupal.org, but it's still not perfect. There is, if you Google content moderation Drupal core on Google, you do get the start of the documentation on Drupal core, but it is there's not a lot there yet, so it's still not documented. The OPA database has been the deepest dive for me using content moderation, so again, that's really where most of my experience comes into play. So the content workflow for the Title 10 database, there are 3 roles that use the content management workflow. There's 2 user roles that can edit content. So getting back to what I said, there's service sites and grantees can both be searched for on the website. The primary difference is some grantees, they have the option to not show up in search. And grantees can also be set as the parent. So a service site will have a parent, whether it's typically a grantee, and that primarily goes into play with content editing permissions that I'll get into later. And there's 2 of the user roles can either approve or reject content. So grantee users are kind of a dual. They can both edit and approve. And the project officers, while they can edit content a little bit, they primarily just approve they pretty much just approve content changes. And the final approval before content is pushed live is a project officer who typically doesn't edit website content or shouldn't. However, they have the permission to edit content if they want to. So basically this is a graphical representation. There's basically 4 content states, 2 of which are review states, which makes this a little bit more complex than a typical content moderation workflow. Most of the time I've done it in the past. There's been a review, and even I've seen it set up for sites where, for instance, if say a page is embargoed until a certain time, the person will set it to in review. And one of the cool things about content moderation is the published version will show up even while a new version is under moderation. So if it takes someone a couple weeks to approve changes, the original page will still show up until the changes are approved. And then this is a little overly simplistic, but basically a service site user can only create drafts, or when they make a change, it'll go to a grantee review. They cannot publish content. Likewise, a grantee can't publish content. They would, if they can either, and they can't make drafts either. If they make a new draft, still needs grantee review, but when they're ready to push it live, it needs RPO review, and then the project officer can either reject or publish content. So why use a content workflow? And I kind of, before I needed to use a content, I always thought it was an extra level of complexity that may not be necessary. So basically, and this pretty much comes from Drupal.org, content workflow, it expands on the default Drupal workflow states of draft, published, and unpublished, so you can create transitional states, for instance, pending review, or you could even create another one called needs to be revised. So if you have a pending review and it gets rejected, instead of going back to draft, it could go to needs to be revised, just as an example. So this allows oversight before content changes are made. So you may notice there's, if you use a site where you can have revisions, which is kind of related to content moderation, where you can put notes if you edit a page, so later someone else can see this new revision, what happened. But the transitional state can also be stored there. So we actually, on the site, and I'll show later, we actually hide the notes, and we show the fields modified instead. And when properly set up and configured, content owners have the ability to edit their own content safely and can submit the changes, but then the workflow doesn't involve moderation, so the ability for the needs to be reviewed or pending review for that content to go live, and that's where content moderation comes in. So I use content moderation. It basically allows you to take these content transitions and you can set them as a permission. So if you have a certain user and you only want them to be able to edit content, you could create a transition of draft to needs review, and you can set up users so they can edit content to their heart's content, but they can't push it live. So again, the default content stays set there. And again, likewise, you can set a transition from needs review to publish, so you can set it so certain users can't create new drafts. All they can do is move content from one workflow state to another. So there you go. So content moderation in Drupal core. So this is kind of my disclaimer before I dig in too deeply with how I've implemented this. So until Drupal 8.4 was released in October 2017, content moderation module was not stable in core. So I think it was included in 8.2, but it still was labeled as experimental or not stable. So since we used the Acquia Lightning distribution and the site was launched on 8.2, at the time, the Acquia Lightning distribution came with Workbench moderation as the content moderation solution. It's still supported with security updates because there was a large adoption of the Workbench moderation before content moderation came out, and it's on my bucket list of things I need to migrate to, but since I have so much custom code, it's not as simple of a translation. And the primary difference is, so Workbench moderation, the workflow states didn't use the workflows module. The content, it basically took that module and split it into two. One's called content moderation, one's called workflows. So Workbench moderation handled all the different states like in itself. Now, now content moderation uses the workflow entity, and then that's kind of how it's done now. So again, this module here, Workbench moderation to content moderation, basically goes ahead and changes the workflow states, but it doesn't handle any custom code. So real quick here, I'm gonna pause. These are all the different moderation state transitions. So you actually go through and you create different moderation states. So in our site, we have RPO review and keep in review, and then you actually set all the different. So for instance, to take a piece of published content and switch it over to needs grantee review, or to take a piece of, from a grantee review to RPO review, and all of these separate transitions can be set as permissions. So you can see here the send back to review, and then you can actually set it by user role. Likewise, in moderation here, you can actually you can take, and this is on the service site for instance, you can set these different types of workflow states. So this is basically the crux of what Workbench moderation or content moderation do, is basically all these different workflow states you set as permissions. Content moderation. So by default, users can moderate all content of a type or content that they own. So for instance, with this website, most of the content is authored by anonymous or authored by an admin. So as anyone who manages a Drupal website as a content manager knows, you can set permissions. For instance, I can edit all of a content type of story or article, or I can only edit content that I've authored. So there's not a lot of solutions out there to custom set permissions. I know there's one where you can set permissions by taxonomy. So for instance, if you wanted to give everyone access to all content that had a certain taxonomy term, but in our case, we wanted the ability for users to be able to edit content that they didn't necessarily author. So that was a challenge that we essentially, in the admin, a service site user has permission to edit any service site, and then we actually do some custom coding to kind of tell the user, okay, before the form's loaded, it checks to see if this is actually something they can modify, and if it's not, then they get thrown an access denied page. But there's not really a solution out there that makes tailored content permissions that simple yet. Another is the rules module for Drupal 8 still hasn't had an update for over a year on its on Drupal.org, even though it's actively developed. So I'm a developer. I don't mind doing custom solutions, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of out of the box, and I think this is why content moderation isn't really used that heavily yet. There's not a lot of support yet for non-developers to set up content moderation on their sites. So again, the service site users, and I'll show these profiles in a minute. We have three roles. We have service site users, and they are we actually, in the user profile, we use entity reference. So service site users are assigned certain service sites that they have permission to edit. The grantees get a little bit more complicated. So like a service site user, they're given grantee nodes that they have permission to edit. But then they also need the ability to approve changes down the path. So then using inheritance, we actually have a function where if they try to edit a service site, we check to make sure that that service site has a parent that they have permission to edit, or that the 2 levels down, if the parent of their parent is one that they have permission to edit. And I'll show that briefly towards the end. The project officer is a little bit different. So they control by regions, and I believe there's 10 different regions, and all the grantees fall under different regions. So project officer, since they mostly review, it's just a taxonomy-based permission. So basically, the grantees and all their children, basically determining on what region they're based off of, that determines whether they have permission to modify that content. So I'll kind of go into the crux of this right now. 1 second. So, and again, we use field permissions, so the only person that can modify which service sites they have access to is an admin, so there's like, the field permission module. But basically here, just as an example, we gave this, this is a test service site user, we gave a permission to edit 2 service sites. The grantee user gave it permission to access, to manage 1 grantee, and this grantee is the parent of those 2 service sites. And the project officer, this grantee falls under, I believe, region 9. Yeah, region 9. So since switching over to the screen multiple times is a huge delay, I'm just going to go in here and just kind of show how this would work for an end user. So these dashboards, and again, the anonymous, this is just because of the data sanitization on my local dev. But basically, these dashboards are all done using views. There's really little to no custom coding. But if somebody wants to edit a clinic, and just as an example, I'll go through and just modify. I'll change the avenue to street. And then I'll go through here and I'll check a couple random services they offer. And then I'll click send updates for publishing. So then this dashboard updates, you can see, and then when if they were to try to edit it while it's in the needs grantee review, they actually get locked for editing, and I'll show how that logic is in the code later. So if I log out and I go to a grantee user, you'll see here, these are all different views using a twig template, but if I want to go to approve changes, it says changes have been made to the following fields. This is custom code as well. I actually, I used the field comparison function from the diff module, and I just repurposed it, and I used the Drupal set message function to put this on here. So if you go down here, the grantee can actually reject the changes or approve them. So if I reject it, you actually have to put a rejection message in. So this is just a content field that I can show later, and basically this rejection message, so if I just want to do more details, reject changes. You'll see it's no longer in pending or submitted. I'll log back in as the service site user. You'll see in action items it says updates needed. So it actually sees now that since it's been kicked to draft, I have the view actually does a search and sees, oh, is there any is there any needs grantee review item that got kicked to draft? Well, then it knows that there's updates needed that got rejected. And you click here to updates needed. It'll actually say rejected revision, the message here. So let's just say I throw in, like I check some more boxes. Okay, I change this around a little bit, and then I click send updates for publishing. And then I log out. I'm going to grantee user. I go in here to approve changes. You'll see that it'll show me what's changed. I'm just going to go through and just approve this time. So send updates for publishing. This was under the project officer. And then I'll log out. They can then either approve, and the project officer can also reject. So this has been sent from needs grantee to needs RPO review. And then they can then publish the site or reject changes. I'm actually going to go ahead a little bit so I don't have to keep switching over my screen. So if you look at the email server on my local, it actually sends out rejection and email messages. This again would be great if there was a module like rules, but this is all done using the mail hook in the module. So basically it takes the content owner, so it actually does a query of all the users in the database. Any user that could potentially approve a change is emailed to approve a change, and likewise, if it's rejected, any person who could have potentially fixed why it was rejected will get an email. So it's a very simple email that gets sent. This is all done using a hook in there. And then I'll just show all the views are done pretty much using contextual filters. So it looks at the person's user ID. We block the views by the role, and then kind of going into the code here. All the dashboards are done using a Twig template, so you can see all the different views are done using. There's some code in the back end to render the view, but then there's pretty much straightforward. So one of the few places where there was custom coding was done in the view. And again, this will be the only coding I really show unless people have questions. So the OPA revision description. Let me actually just go back to my. So right here, we actually go into the grantee node edit. So we actually build a tree. So we actually go through and we take before a person edits. So obviously the views, we don't have to worry about them because since it uses contextual filters, it'll only show the person content in the dashboard that they have access to edit. However, if you go in and edit it, in theory, somebody could go in and edit random nodes and do a grantee. So then this is a further it goes through and it gets the person's organization, we get its parents, and then we actually just check in to see whether or not the person can edit it. So that was done by manual code. Likewise, the rejection messaging is done using just the node the hook form alter of the node edit form. So I'm going to switch back over to the presentation. Custom coding, like I said, like I showed, custom coding is typically required when content state changes. So one of probably the issues with content moderation right now is a developer is still needed. But I think once more modules like rules get like an actual 1.0 release or actually are stable, I could see content moderation being more widely used. So like I showed, rejection logic and update notifications, those all require custom coding when you could easily add a rule that sends an email when a certain action happens or shows a rejection message if a certain action happens. And then the other thing is the custom buttons. So as you can see, those update buttons by default, when you install content moderation, it actually has a drop down. So instead of clicking save or whatever, you actually have to select the state and then submit it. And from a UI perspective, it didn't really match our comps and it changed. So that was kind of a challenge that we ran into as well. I showed this, so the email notifications and the diff and the rejection messaging, that was some customization we did. I showed the content dashboards and views as well. So all of the dashboard, all of the dashboards for the different users were done using views and a twig template. And yeah. So despite the custom permissions, the dashboards are actually easier. And the dashboards, despite their complexity, there's a little bit of code in there. Okay, so caveats I've noticed with content moderation. So one thing we noticed, since we have more than one pending revision state, it's difficult, it's tricky when there's multiple workflow states. So if somebody were to go to needs to RPO review, get rejected, put the grantee, probably one of the most complicated pieces of code was determining when the last published revision was. It's probably, it is easier in content moderation, but earlier on, it was very difficult for us to show the right rejection message and show the right fields that were modified based on the last revision. And depending on how Drupal is served, whether it's headless or whether it's decoupled, you may not want to have content moderation, especially, I know with Gatsby, the whole site gets rebuilt sometimes if content gets published, so I'd almost maybe have a decoupled Drupal that just does content moderation. Users who approve content shouldn't be able to edit content or vice versa. This really hasn't been a problem for us, but you probably would want to have the one user that can move from, say, needs review to publish, not be able to edit content. Otherwise, there's not a second set of eyes proofreading stuff. And like I said earlier, minor Drupal releases sometimes make major UI changes. So from 8.3 to 8.4, we actually couldn't really roll that out that quickly because we wound up having to change a lot of the UI in order to keep our design consistent. Inactive content, keeping content up to date. The dashboards that I showed, they show content that needs to be updated. So for instance, with grantees, when you log in as a grantee, we actually show, so after 90 days, they have to click a button that basically creates a new draft, so it goes right from published to published. So they have the ability to do that, and that kind of makes sure that there's no stale content. Email notifications when content state changes. So not only those emails are showed when content state changes, but there's also emails that are sent out to users when content hasn't been updated for 3 months. Mostly just like, hey, log in, review all your service sites or all your grantees, make sure all the content's up to date. Like there. And then just keeping the site as simple as possible. So those dashboards actually, we don't use the Drupal content admin. We create the dashboard. People can see what content they have access to manage. On the side, the pending actions really helps. That's really not included by default. So just seeing what stuff they need to approve, what stuff they need to edit, or even seeing what they're able to edit helps out a lot. So that's it. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Or do I need to show anything more further? Yes.
So, of all the challenges with this moderation, why not? You seem like you were talking to people out of using the workbench module, which I've used in the past. I mean, shouldn't that be the opposite? Like, stick with workbench for now until the moderation is actually.
So you're asking why am I great from Workbench, and I actually, that's why I'm in no hurry to update to content moderation. I'm a kind of a believer, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And honestly, Workbench moderation is still updated. So I know last year there was a huge JSON bug that was released. Workbench moderation was updated the same day Drupal core was updated. It's mostly just future looking, so I'm looking at when Drupal 9 gets released. And then also, it works for now, but it's one of those things where I'd rather do what the community's doing, just so being, unless the site's getting rebuilt, more than likely, all the focus is going to be put on the new modules. But yes, to your point, there's no point in updating, and that's why it's been a year since I've, haven't really worried about updating it. So I'm still updating it. And again, for my site to update the content moderation, since I've done so much customization with the updates, it would just be a lot. It's not as simple as me just changing the states. because I've changed how the UI looks, and there's emails and everything, it would be a lot of code refactoring that would have to take place.
Yeah, because it's almost like saying, it's almost like you said, don't use Workbench on.
Well, and honestly, if you go to their Drupal.org page, it literally says, do not use a new site. But it still works. I mean, if you wanted to set up a Drupal 8.7 site with Workbench moderation, fine. And like I said, I mean, the two modules are exactly the same, only different. I didn't really go into like, I didn't even really get involved into like, I'm sure there was some sort of forum battle or whatever, but basically the only difference is like Workbench moderation is kind of like more of a monolithic. It has the states built in, and the content moderation, you know, it's kind of abstracted. So I get the idea, but again, it's kind of the fee for an early adopter of Drupal 8. For Drupal 8, we're locked in Workbench. And again, if you look at who sponsored the module, I mean, it's definitely still it's going to be supported for a while because a lot of major sites still use it.
And then rules, and you mentioned that the challenges that comes with the moderation is that rules have not been updated almost a year ago.
Correct. And honestly, I know I think other developers have worked on it. We've all independently at time to try to implement rules before doing custom coding, and it just doesn't work with it. It's created bugs. And again, since this site's built using Composer, it's very difficult for me to to say, I want to use the dev at this date and roll patches in. I mean, and again, I can't complain too much because it's not like I'm helping to fix the problem either. You know what I mean? So I want to put that one out there. But yeah, and again, I'm a developer. Like I'm comfortable coding, but like I think for future-proofing a site and for making a site easier to manage, I'm a full proponent of using open source solutions. Using someone else's code. But unfortunately that I think is the biggest holdback to content moderation being used more frequently. And kind of getting back to the beginning, like my whole thing is like I'd love people to be able to update their content. I asked the question because it's like earlier on in my career when I was doing content updates, I'm like, everyone can't be doing this. And then the more I've moved to organization to organization, more and more people are updating sites, and a lot of time is spent in Drupal making it like really awesome to edit content, but like nobody can really use it yet. Especially too in a government situation, I know sometimes we're not able to do that, but even in the private sector where people are a little bit more relaxed with the rules, it's just really, people aren't updating their content yet.
Question about dealing with publishing or deploying content across servers. Let's say, all the content is dropped in and moderated and published on the staging site, but you can kind of get that showing up on the production site. Like, what are some of the tools to get content moved over?
I think it depends. That's a good question. So tools to move content over. I mean, I know I built a demo, and this is back on Drupal 7. You could use the services module to use you could build an API where when content's published. So like on using I think the hook, you can use on the submission. You can actually have it shoot a requests over from a staging server to a production server. If you're using AWS, you can get fancy. I know one of the sites I work on, and freely will admit I'm not comfortable doing this myself. You could use a Lambda, so you could use like, you get a PHP ping something on AWS and push content out live. So for instance, and this is something I haven't done yet, but if you have a decoupled solution and you really want to use content moderation, if people log into Drupal, you almost can have a content staging server that the content editors they don't actually go into the production server, but they can deploy from that staging server to production. I know I've been on a couple of websites that do that. So that would, you probably wouldn't want people to use the production, but in this case, they actually are on the production server pushing content. And that is something, honestly, I want to look at maybe like in a year or two when the budget's there to potentially say, hey, let's, but for right now, it hasn't been an issue for us.
Question, have you ever, let me see, but have you had situations where it isn't just information updating, but like say an article, for example, and like you have multiple contributors and you want to kind of maintain a consistent look, and one of the ways you would likely does maybe a style. So if you had a situation where you had to help dictate that in regards to like content,
So yeah, have I done it in the past? Yes, not on this site. This site, there are a couple of long form text fields, but nothing that requires formatting. So I know I've used I forget which module it was for Drupal 7, and I know it did use authoring, but no, I've not. I'm sorry, I can't. Not on this site, no. well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I don't present that often, so I'm sorry if I talk too fast and my allergies are kind of bugging. But anyway, thank you very much. You guys have a good rest of the week.